Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deborah DeJonka-Berry. I'm the director at the Eastham Public Library, and I have two fellow staff members here with me, Janice Riley and Karen McDonald, and we'll be moderating the chat and the question and answer at the end of Stephen's program. He's got quite a wonderful presentation, and I'm so looking forward to it, and it's my job to briefly introduce Stephen. Stephen Peters is, and this is my favorite part, he is branding and creative development whiz, the branding and creative development whiz at Smoke Signals. And he really is a whiz. He's been with us for a couple years now, he and his mom, kind of holding our hand a lot as we have been working on our Eastham 400 projects. And so today, Stephen's going to speak to us on a nation's founding from an Indigenous perspective. And I'm going to turn it right over to Stephen.
Thank you so much. That was really nice introduction. So I'm Steve Peters, and I work with my mother. We have very much a family business. So my mother and I have been doing a lot of work with museums and organizations that are interested in early European Native American interactions, the impact that that's had on the tribes today with colonization, and our way of going about doing that is obviously one to try and understand the history that was laid out by our ancestors as well as by the Europeans that were here at that time. So we take a look at their diaries, their records, their manifests documenting everything that came on and off their ships, some of the major interactions that they had, other major works as well, such as Mort's Relation, which is a really good resource for understanding the Pilgrim's Landing and what they came here and what they found. But we also as well use art and video to try and tell that story as well in a way that people can relate to it. And we do that by working with more of our extended family. One of the people that you will see at the Eastham Library down the road is my uncle Robert Peters, who's an artist, and he really does an amazing job of trying to show where he fits as a contemporary Native American, and just his mix of art that he does is really fascinating. We've used him for the Our Story exhibit. He developed a map that we'll talk about later on, that as well as a diagram that depicts the Great Dying, which was really a dark period for my ancestors. So we have the family business. We rely a lot on other tribal members as well for traditional art. And art, we find, is a great way to engage people in, our story and wanting to learn more. We've done that with the development of a wampum belt, which is currently traveling the UK, but will be coming back here soon. And that was a really unique way to engage people in the history of the King Philip's War, Metacom's belt, and just the traditional art form of developing a bead, how it was used to document our history as well. So art's an important piece. And we do all this because what we found is that history, the way that it was written, and to some extent continues to be written today as well, it's very black and white. There's a clear start point and an end point to every major event, and there's no question that it's the events that took place around major parts of our history were not that clean. And to that extent as well, there's always seems to be this need to justify who was right and who was wrong. Who was civil and who was a savage. And it's very clear that if you were on the losing side of history, you didn't have much of a chance to to take part in the way that that story was then told for generations afterwards. And so that's been a difficult part, because history has not always been kind to Native Americans, to say the least. And so, you know, with history, when we take a look at that, it's like, okay, there's a clear start point, there's a clear end point in the way that the history was written. When we talk about the founding of this country, we tend to fall on sort of two major events. You know, there were the Pilgrims landing in 1620, and there was the Harvest Festival in 1621, which became sort of the benchmark for what became the Thanksgiving holiday. And so when we learn about that growing up, it was kind of like nothing happened prior to 1620 here in this country. Like that there was just nothing going on, that there were just people that were just kind of waiting around for the Pilgrims to arrive. And then when they did arrive, they welcomed them, thankfully, taught them how to hunt, fish, grow corn. And then they all had this wonderful feast, and then the natives kind of all died off, and you know, we were gone. And obviously that's not the case, because we are still here. And it's painful to look at history that way, especially from a Native American perspective. And it's damaging. It's damaging to not understand history the way that it happened, because we're then deemed to just continue to repeat history over and over again. And you are going to see through some of the pieces that we show as well that we are still grappling with a lot of the same issues that we were 400 years ago, 300 years ago, 50 years ago. So we'll take a look at that. But when we look at 1620, you know, that and the Pilgrims founding, the Pilgrims arrival, from my mother and I, you know, when we took a look at that, and when people started to approach us around the 400th commemoration and saying, look, you know, we'd really like to do some work around you telling the story from the perspective of your people, we looked at it and we said, well, we can't start the story in 1620. That doesn't allow people to really put into context everything that was going on, so that they can then understand the decisions that were made in 1620. And so for us, that story had to start much earlier. And so we decided to use a starting point of 1614. And we chose 1614 because it allowed us to get people to understand that there was this village of Patuxet, which was in what is now Plymouth, and became Plymouth Colony. And also in 1614, not only did you have this village of Patuxet that was really doing quite well, the way that we understand it, but you also had within that village as well, Tisquantum, who comes to be known Squanto. That's the village that he came from. And in 1614, you have some traders that come through, and one of them is Thomas Hunt. And so he comes into the village of Patuxet, and he's supposed to trade. He's supposed to trade fairly for goods, bring them back to Spain to sell them and make money. But instead, for some reason, he decides to capture 27 young men and bring them back to Spain and sell them as slaves. And so one of them was Tisquantum. And so that's how he learns English. He was taken from his village and sold as a slave. He's the only one of those 27 young men that we know returned, but he's not the only Wampanoag that we know was able to return after being taken slave. Because also in 1614, you had a Wampanoag from Martha's Vineyard, which was Nope Island, and he found his way back in 1614. So he had been taken as slave, and in 1614, he actually sort of almost crossed paths with Tisquantum, going in the opposite direction, and he makes his way back. We do know that he was able to make his way back by learning enough English while he was there to tell his captors that there was gold on Martha's Vineyard. Obviously, there's no gold on Martha's Vineyard, but he knew that that's what they wanted, and that if he wanted to get a ride home, he was going to have to tell them that there was something of significant value on this side. So he told them it was gold on Martha's Vineyard. They gave him a ride back, and he was able to jump off the side of the ship and make his way ashore, and stay away from the Europeans on that one. And so those were really important events to understand, because not only then do you understand that you had the village of Patuxent, but you understand that there was a good amount of contact that had been taking place between the Europeans and the Native Americans here prior to 1620. And you see as well that it wasn't always a friendly relationship either. And the fact that natives were being taken slave, that items were being stolen, graves were being robbed, that was not lost on the Wampanoags. And they had my ancestors had a fairly healthy communication system that took place between the villages as well. So if something happened to the Nauset's, or something happened in Patuxent or Nope, that information would have flowed around the community as well. So that there was a degrading in the relationship between the Europeans and the Wampanoags. And so the fact that 27 young men could have been taken from Patuxent would have been devastating, and it would have rippled through the entire Wampanoag nation. When you have a village of a few hundred Native Americans, and 27 of them are just snatched away. They're just gone. And one minute they're going off to trade, and they never come back. You don't know what happened. And that would have been emotional, but it also would have impacted that village's ability to do the jobs it needed to succeed, and that was really hard. So getting that emotion across is always important for us in the work that we do. After Tisquantum is taken slave, something else occurs at the village of Patuxent. And in 1616, there was a French fishing ship that wrecked off the coast of Patuxent. And shortly after that, a plague starts to rip through the Wampanoag Nation. And through our research and other documents as well, it seems like that event where that French ship wrecked off the coast of Patuxent seems likely that may have caused that plague, because there are accounts of one of the fishermen coming ashore, coming into the village, and showing signs of sickness with yellowing of skin, fever, and dying shortly afterwards. And after that, you've got a plague that just ripped through the Wampanoag Nation, and Patuxent is ground zero for that plague. And there are accounts of upwards of 100,000 Wampanoag dying between 1616 and 1619. And that would have been, just catastrophic. That is a significant percentage of our population. We're talking 70–80% of Wampanoags dying within 3 years. And the village of Patuxent, being ground zero for that, is abandoned. They leave the village. Either everyone died in that village, or if they didn't die, they left and they knew not to go back there, because if you go there, you get sick and you die. And we don't think that plague was spread necessarily on purpose, but it was a sickness that simply my ancestors had no immunity to. And it's odd that here we are at the 400th commemoration of the Mayflower Crossing, and we've got another plague that's just kind of ripping through our communities. It's history continues to repeat itself over and over again. And those, so, I mentioned those two things, both 1614 and then 1616 to 1619, because it helps you then start to understand why certain decisions were made when the Pilgrims arrived in 1620. And you guys are I'm sure extremely familiar with the Pilgrims' arrival, off the coast of your area, in Eastham, Provincetown, and their travels during those first couple of days that they were there as well. But it seems like that understanding what happened prior to that makes the decisions that were made that much more complex, because obviously the easy decision would be like, look, these Europeans have been bad news for us. They're taking us as slaves. They're robbing our graves. They're taking our material. They don't respect our culture, our traditions. Let's run them off or kill them. But that wasn't necessarily the decision that was made as a whole. It was a decision that the Gnostics made after a little while. And I think that the Gnostics probably took their time, because these pilgrims, when they arrived, were a different group. When you look at an event like the first washing, and that's an event that obviously can be overlooked very quickly, because you're like, oh, they washed their clothes, and it was just kind of a nothing event, but it really wasn't. Not only at that particular time are they fixing the shallop up, the pilgrims are fixing their shallop up and discussing about what to do next, which leads to the first encounter a few days afterwards. But you have to think of it from the Gnostic perspective. And so the Gnostics, who absolutely would have been watching every move that the pilgrims would have been making, would have, for the very, very first time ever, seen women and children step off of a boat and then come ashore and start washing their clothes. So they're watching it, and they've had all these contact with European men prior to this, and the Gnostics had some very difficult interactions with some merchants not too long prior to the Pilgrims' arrival, where they actually took them captured, most likely killed some of them. They were not happy with the Europeans at this point. But they would have been watching, and they're like, oh my gosh, there's women and children. Like, what's going on here? This is a group with very, very, very different motivations. And so I think they watched them for a while. It's not something that's written in any of the history books, but that's something that we feel pretty confident would have happened. You can't sail a ship like that off the shore of Provincetown and not catch the attention of the local natives. So we think they watched them. They'd had enough at a certain point, and they fired some arrows at the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims fired a couple shots back. There were no accounts of anybody being hit. Seemed like maybe they were just warning shots, and kind of saying, hey, look, move along, we've had enough. So they ushered them along, and the Pilgrims went and settled at Patuxet Village. And there are accounts when they come into Patuxet Village of them literally having to sweep away the bones of the dead, because that's how fast the plague had ripped through. And when you read it in the diaries and some of the books, it seems like the Great Dying was just, it doesn't ever really, I feel like, put it into context. And even with Tisquantum, when he returns in 1619 with Dermer, Dermer writes in his diaries only one tiny little passage which says they said they returned and found all were dead. And that's it. That's all he said. But that had to have been so much more emotional for Tisquantum. Here he is, Tisquantum. He's been gone since 1614. Finds his way back with Dermer in 1619, and had to have been holding out hope that he'd find some family someone from his village, something, and he comes back and just all are gone. And so the first video that I want to share with you is a video that talks about Tisquantum's return in 1619. And we decided to do this video because we felt like there needed to be some emotion that was put into this. So in the video, you've got Tisquantum, you have Dermer, and they're talking about their passage back, which was sponsored by this gentleman, Sir Ferdinando Gorges, who it's important to note as well, this guy Gorges, he was also involved with EPL when EPL was captured. So EPL knew of this guy as well, and we'll talk about that for a minute after as well. But let me pull this up. This is Zoom, so it's a little clunky when I kind of move between these two screens here. So just bear with me for half a second while I get this up for you.
Tisquantum. The skies have cleared, and there's a good wind to carry us south down the coast. My friend, Etomp, you'll be home in just a few days.
I've changed in these 5 years. I'm certain that much has changed in my homeland. There may be new leaders among us, new alliances, and for certain, no one has forgotten the 27 men that were stolen from their families and villages. That is more than a ripple in the water to make smooth, Thomas.
Captain Hunt was a rogue, a scoundrel since been branded a pirate for his deeds.
My father was a great whale hunter, revered and respected by everyone. One day, his Mashun did not return. Each morning upon waking, my mother Nukas would go to the shore and stare at the horizon, waiting for him. I had no heart to tell her to stop hoping. Does she still now wait by the shore with a twice broken heart, waiting for a husband who will never return, and a son who she does not know is still alive?
What you have endured, Etomp, was undeserved indeed.
Nukas depended on me to provide for her, to fish, to hunt, so long as I didn't go for whale. I would bring her deer and fish, and sometimes clay from the cliffs of Nope Island. Nukas made the finest pots of clay. They were prized by any who owned one. But still Nukas longed for an iron kettle, as only the Englishmen made. After the visit from our Netomp, John Smith, his second ship came into the harbor and offered to trade. Captain Hunt admired our beaver skins. I asked if they could show me an iron kettle. He said yes. There were kettles, and many other novelties too, too cumbersome to bring ashore.
Our reputation among your people has been tarnished. But now, Sir Ferdinando Gorges has sponsored your passage home to help us, to repair that damage that has been done, to help future relations for trade and to settle among you.
Thomas, you will never know what my brothers and I endured after we were tricked and stolen away to Spain. You will never know what it is to be packed in the dark and foul belly of Hunt's ship like brined cod. I know not Gorges well, but settle among savages, Mata Netomp, he's a fool.
Agreed. I am just one man, but if you introduce me as a gentleman, I trusted Netomp.
Thomas, So many of your men have gone before you and abused our trust. Your kind is far apart from ours, and your religion takes you on a narrow path. You see darkness where we see light. To honor the earth and live in balance with the four-legged, the winged, the finned, is not savage. I have dreamed of nothing but to go home again.
This voyage will take you home, but it may not be as you remember. There have been reports of such sickness that in some villages scarcely any survived.
What has become of Nukas?
Mata, Nukas na no.
So that was a really emotional piece for us to produce, but we thought it was important so that people could understand the the human impact that colonization had on natives. And Tisquantum and Dermot as well were just two really kind of fascinating characters that really hadn't been, I think, accurately portrayed or explored. So that's why we really tackled that piece the way that we did. And we saw Tisquantum and Dermer as really kind of these interesting characters because they obviously had this very close relationship. There must have been a lot of trust between the two of them. And because when they arrived back here in 1619, there's an account of them running into EPL. And EPL obviously would have had a grudge against Sir Ferdinando Gorges, and the fact that Dermer was there on his behalf would not have gone over well. So there's this account of them running into EPL And Epenau basically is going to kill Dermer. And Tisquantum stands up for Dermer, and stops that, which, I have such a hard time sort of racking my head around that, because, here you are, I mean, you finally make it back amongst your own people, but, you're faced with this conflict and you decide to stand up for the European. And I think that probably says a lot for how the natives treated Tisquantum following that. I'm not sure that there was a ton of trust in Tisquantum after that. And it probably has a lot to do with why Tisquantum ends up ultimately living with the Pilgrims, as opposed to in a village. That's really kind of interesting. Following that, in 1620, obviously the Pilgrims settle in the village of Patuxet. They sweep away the bones of the dead, and they raise their homes, and they make an agreement with Usamequin as well. And I'm not sure that there was really a clear understanding on the part of my ancestors what they were really getting themselves into. That there was going to be a real difference in the idea of ownership of land, and how land could be bordered, and how borders could be enforced, and the fact that the laws of my ancestors would not be respected by the Europeans, but the Europeans would absolutely expect the natives to follow the laws of the Europeans. And so because of that, I think you immediately had a recipe for disaster. It ultimately, it took 50 years for it to turn into war. But there was, at least an attack on a way of living, the culture, and our land that had taken place almost immediately after the Pilgrims' arrival. And there's another video that I want to show you that I thought it does a good job of depicting that friction that would have risen because of the cultural differences between the two groups. And I'd have to say as well that my ancestors, obviously they went into that agreement because they were so depleted by everything that had happened prior to that. We were in desperate need of an ally and support at that point because of the Great Dying, because of the slavery, all of those pieces there put my ancestors in a difficult spot, and we were being threatened by neighboring tribes, and we had no way of really defending ourselves at that point because the plague had just been so devastating. So I have this video that I think does a nice job of explaining that. And so we chose in this one here to have Governor Bradford talk about that. And so let me pull that video up for you.
In this colony, we are the loyal subjects of King James. Upon our arrival to these shores, where we had been driven off course by harsh conditions, we discovered ourselves in a region in which we had no charter to settle. In doing so, we developed a compact that I assisted in the development of. The compact was signed by all 41 adult men of the colony before we even departed the Mayflower. The compact established a civil body in order for freemen, who are the stockholders of the colony, to participate in politics and the judicial aspects of our colony, to pass laws, to collect taxes, to hand down punishments. All, of course, as subjects of the king and in our service to the greater glory of God. Servants and women, of course, were not eligible to participate in governing activities. Our first governor was John Carver, who served barely a year before his death. God rest his soul. I was elected to succeed him. We self-govern with broad power to codify our own laws on a case-by-case basis. Of course, no laws are established that would be repugnant to the crown. Have Master Spirit Usamikwan and his people, but don't govern over them. When they are among us, though, we do hold them to the standard of our laws and of the Lord God, our Savior. Despite that they are important allies, Usamikwan's people are uncivilized and live without the rule of law or loyalty to a king. Quite the contrary, Usamikwan must answer to his own people, who conduct themselves freely to do as they please. Even some of the women hold places of power. Odd practices. May God help them.
Okay. So yes, we thought that was a good video for showing just the differences that would have been there. Obviously, one of the biggest differences that would have run into is that we were a matriarchal society. And so as a matriarchal society, women could absolutely rise to the highest positions. One of them that we know of is Awashanks. And the friction that came out of that, because, obviously Bradford and others would have had an extremely difficult time having to make and negotiate with a woman. They had such a difficult time doing that as well that they actually went around her and went to her sons, Awashank's sons, to negotiate for her land. If you can imagine the rift that would cause in a community and a family, that's just absolutely wild. So we have that piece that we went through for leading up to 1620, and all of that we feel like is important to then understand why the Wampanoags allowed the Pilgrims to settle in the village of Patuxet. Following that, we have the Harvest Festival of 1621 that becomes the Thanksgiving holiday, something that is widely blown out of proportion. That's an event obviously that came out after the Civil War, and there was a need to create some sort of a national holiday that would bring the country back together. And so Thanksgiving was created. It is absolutely just 100% a product of America. And when you look at it as a product, it's a product that had to be created, and the cost of it was the cost of my ancestors' culture, our identity. All of that had to be left out, wiped out, in the need to create the Thanksgiving holiday the way that it was. And originally the first Thanksgiving holiday the way that it was developed. Wampanoag, the word Wampanoag, our ancestors are never even mentioned in it. And so, instead they came up with these images and this story that's just persisted through the generations. And it's often seen in a way kind of like this image. I'll show you this one image here. That's it's a popular historical image of what they felt like that harvest festival looked like. It looked like pilgrims feeding the Wampanoag. Not to mention the dress and attire in this is just wrong all the way across the board, from the pilgrims to obviously my ancestors with the headdresses and the pants, and even in the back end, like you see this woman in the back that's leading a native woman around, like she doesn't know where to go or she needs help. None of that is actually accurate to what occurred. And what did occur is, what we know of that occurred is from a small passage in Mort's Relations, which basically says that Massasoit showed up with 90 warriors. They stayed for a couple of days. They ate. They played some games, and that's it. That's all that it says. So we don't know that any women were there. They could have been, but that's not what was written down in history. It says that 90 warrior men showed up. And it's hard to imagine that the pilgrims sent out an invitation to these 90 warriors to come over and hang out. I mean, that would have vastly outnumbered their men, and would have put them in a really submissive position at their own table as well. And so I'll stop sharing this one here, and I'll show you one other image that we think, based on Mort's relation and the description that he has, is a far more accurate depiction of what this looks like. And you may have already seen this as well, because this is from a local artist, Karen Ronaldo, out of Falmouth. And I really like the job that she did with her depiction of this harvest festival. Here you see 90 warriors. They were the pilgrims. It does not show them as being in need or being served to. It likely was a show of force. That Massasoit was showing up on the doorstep in 1621 to say, look, just so that you know, we could still run you out of here any moment if we needed to. I'd like to think that that's probably more accurate, but we don't know that for sure. But it seems to make a lot more sense than the pilgrims sending out an invitation to say, 90 warrior men, come on over and enjoy some food and drinks and fun with us for 3 days. That doesn't seem to make sense at all. It obviously does work for the product of Thanksgiving and the purpose that it was created for, but it's not accurate to the history that we have. And so that, getting that history right is kind of what we're all about today. And I do greatly appreciate the fact that, here at the 400th commemoration of the Mayflower Crossing, there has been a platform that's been provided to historians, to Native Americans, to tell history the way that occurred. And they're doing that. We're doing it without censorship, which is something that did not and could not have happened 50 years ago. And as you guys are all well aware, 50 years ago, there was an invitation that was given out to Frank James to come in and provide a speech at a governor's banquet in September of 1970. And Frank James thoughtfully put together remarks about the impact of colonization, the fact that history has not always been kind to our people or accurate, and that, the impacts of what happened 400 years ago would continue to happen following that in the name of colonization has negatively impacted our community to this day. And until we can face that, we're not going to be able to move forward in a more compassionate way that allows us to heal. When he showed that speech, which in my opinion was a very passive speech, he could have gone a lot further. But nevertheless, they looked at it and they said, no, you absolutely cannot give this speech. That would fly in the face of the narrative that we've created around the Pilgrims' arrival and the relationship they had with the Wampanoag people. And that was just 50 years ago. That wasn't a long time ago. But today we're at a place where we have been given that opportunity to get that story right. Unfortunately, we're still combating generations of the inaccurate history that's been just continually reinforced through popular culture, through stereotypes of Native Americans, through sports mascots. All of these things have continued to contribute to the inaccurate perception of my ancestors 400 years ago and who we are today. So we've got a lot of work that still needs to be done. And, it's such a complex sort of history and relationship, especially when we talk about in contemporary times around like the Thanksgiving holiday and what it means for myself and my family. It's a really complex question to answer, which is why I'm going to show you the last and final video of this, which is on the National Day of Mourning, because I think it does a really great job of putting into context just how challenging of a holiday that is for my people. So let me pull that up for you now.
In 1621, Pilgrims and Indians sat down to the first Thanksgiving dinner in Plymouth, Massachusetts. They ate wild turkey and corn, and everyone had a good time.
Most Americans celebrated Thanksgiving today by eating turkey, praying, and/or watching parades and football games.
There was a groundswell of Native awareness beginning to happen in the late 60s, early 70s. And that led to the National Day of Mourning.
There are days and there are times when some of those stories need to be able to spread out and make some room for the story that's being told here and now. And on that place, on that day, at Coles Hill, at feet of Metacom, above Plymouth Rock, that day, that time, that space, that should be a space for Wampanoag people to tell our story.
First Thanksgiving of the Pilgrims as their holiday, and it was it's a complete farce because it had nothing to do with celebrating the unity of the Indian people and the Pilgrims, and it was the beginning of all things to come. And so we have nothing to celebrate.
As a first grader, when the Thanksgiving story became the focus of our teachings at school, I remember the teacher talking about the Pilgrims coming to Plymouth and how friendly Indians taught them how to live, how to plant, how to fish in the area. And then she said they had this great Thanksgiving feast together, and unfortunately after that, all of the Indians died of a horrible plague. And I must have been waving my hand madly, and I told her that it's not true. They're not all gone because I am a Wampanoag. And she smiled and she just said, well, of course you are.
There was a groundswell of actions that was beginning to happen all over the country, and it was happening here in Massachusetts as well as across the country.
A group of militant American Indians moved into the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington last night, and after some they took the building over.
We see no reason why we should have to go to any other building but this one, so we're staying.
Well, for a month now, the Indians have held Alcatraz, and though the federal government has asked them to leave, they show no inclination to depart.
They took over Alcatraz in 1969, stayed occupied through 1970.
There was a clause in the Fort Laramie Treaty that said that all government lands that were no longer being occupied had to go back to the Indian people. And Alcatraz had been unused for a number of years, and they went out there and they took that.
Every Indian brother, every sympathizer will go back to their homes with a different thought about what Thanksgiving Day means to the Native American. It is a day of mourning.
Frank James was a school teacher from Chatham. He was a member of the Aquina tribe. He was a Gayhead native. Frank was very well spoken, very well educated.
The folks of Plymouth decided to make an invitation to Frank James, an Aquina Wampanoag, to ask him to say some words about the 350th anniversary at that point of the Mayflower and the Plymouth colony.
They were stuck in that belief that their little picture that they drew of themselves and the Indians was the reality for everybody.
They said that, well, we can't allow you to read that because 90% of the people would walk out. He said he wasn't going to change it. We decided that we would declare it a National Day of Mourning for Native people.
It's really a very mild and passive speech by many of today's standards when you look at it. It simply reflects on that the history was not always kind to the Wampanoag people. The Wampanoag people didn't always fare well from this meeting, and that bad things had happened in the past, and hopefully we can reconcile and move to better things in the future. And that's about the best you can say and be truthful about what actually happened. They decided to start observing the day of mourning as opposed to Thanksgiving.
So he came back with the American Indian movement. Russell Means, Dennis Banks. They ran the AIM flag up on the Mayflower.
Everything was a huge, just a sea of people. You know, up by the statue of Massasoit, you know, climbing the statue. And I remember when they climbed the Mayflower, the masts of the Mayflower, and when good old Captain Jones took a header over the side. And, you know, it just made us aware of what it meant to be Native and what history means and what happened to us in history and how we should be responding to that.
Certainly there are gains from having these commemorations. These commemorations are a part of being able to share and tell our story, to be able to tell our truth to the world around us. And that's an important thing because it's been something that's been denied us as Native people far too often.
It's been 50 years, and we're still fighting the same fight. In general, the attitudes of some have changed, but for the most part, the deniers, they just want to say either get over it, we are all Americans right now. The bottom line is they have too much at stake to give us what is rightfully ours.
We're still having to do where our ability to put our land is being put under threat right now as we speak. It's being put through the halls of the United States Senate. Right now as we speak, we are having to prove our identity to a colonial government. Right now, we have to deal with the impacts of the environmental damage that folks who've come here from other places have done to this homeland that we have. To have to fight for that simple acknowledgement is crazy because we're here, we've always been here.
So that's where we are at today. We covered, gosh, 406 years in a short amount of time. Obviously, we skipped over a lot. The intent was to just provide enough background that you can start to make reasonable assumptions about the history, the way that it occurred, and challenging what we had learned growing up as well, and hopefully spark everyone to go out and just want to research more, because that's where the truth lies. And so yeah, you have to go out and continue to look and read. It's not hard to find. So that's where we're at. I thank you guys for having me on today, and certainly welcome any questions.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. We do have a couple questions here. I'll read the first one. This is from FSC's iPhone, and he or she asks, can you please comment on the historical novel by Geraldine Brooks, which was Caleb's Crossing 2011? That was based on the Wampanoag from the Vineyard, who was the first Indigenous person to have attended and graduated from Harvard.
I have not read that, so unfortunately I'm not able to comment on it, but it is on my reading list, so we'll get to it.
Okay. And we have another one from FSC. It says, west of Boston in Sudbury, there are many roads and some markers recognizing Metacomet, Massasoit, and others who were originally from the Cape area. Can you comment on their activities there? And thank you for a wonderful presentation. So she's wondering about the markers
thanks.
off Cape in Sudbury.
Yeah, so there's certainly a lot of travel that would have been going on, and that's an area out there that I think is probably a little closer towards the Massachusetts tribe as well. So I'm not sure exactly what those markers would have been there, but there would have obviously been a lot of travel that took place. So I'm not sure exactly what they reference, but it wouldn't surprise me that our ancestors, I mean, there's accounts of our messenger runners being able to run 60 miles in a day. And when I talked earlier about there being healthy communication between the villages in the area, that's how that occurred, is that they had people that would travel those paths and deliver important messages, so that everybody was able to either understand the news as it was occurring or be able to weigh in when a decision needed to be made from the collective whole of the Wampanoag Nation. So, they were out there representing a very large area. And the Wampanoag Nation was at that point 69 villages, so it spanned a large territory.
We have a question from Deb Abbott, who says, where do we go from here? 2020 has brought Indigenous people into the spotlight. How do we keep your story in the forefront?
Yeah, that's the question that we continue to wrap our head around at our table as well. And our main goal is to be able to continue to get the history out to as broad of an audience as possible. And so one of the ways that we're doing that is by working with school systems, working with them on curriculum development. We're also working with educational companies like BrainPop, which I believe BrainPop is in 30 or 40% of the schools in the United States at this point, on developing content for children. So we're teaching them the story correctly from the start up, and doing it in a way that is healthy as well. Obviously there's a lot of pieces of this story that are challenging for kids in first grade, second grade, third grade to digest. But we're working with people like BrainPop to develop these cartoons that get the main points across in a way. And then obviously with high school and others, working with those textbook creators and using our videos and curriculum to really reinforce that story at older ages. The other thing that we're doing as well to try and continue to get that message out there is try and work more with popular media. So we're trying to work with some larger broadcast outlets to develop a lot more of the videos that we've created and put them out in a format that that the large population can get to. Up to this point with the commemoration, we've really been able to get the history corrected with educators and people that are interested in the education and history. Beyond that, getting out to the general public has been a challenge, and it'll continue to be as well. So that's what we're trying to work through, but I think that's the best way to do it. The other thing that we ask as well is, with groups like yours, when we have these holidays, Thanksgiving, take a moment to share the history when you're giving thanks. We're not, and I'm certainly not one that's advocating getting rid of Thanksgiving or the holiday, because it's we go to my family, they'll go down to the National Day of Mourning, and then after that we all get together and have a dinner just like everyone else's. Obviously this year was different because of COVID, but normally we have a big turkey dinner. The whole family gets together because there's nothing else that we have. We don't have to work. You've got like those 3 or 4 days that are just carved out for spending some time to have a big meal and give thanks with your family. And that's a great thing. And so we're not advocating getting rid of Thanksgiving holiday at all. Simply just asking people to be thoughtful about what they're giving thanks for, because that's the most important thing. It's also important to know too that, although the Thanksgiving holiday is a product of America, and so, that's its thing, the idea of a Thanksgiving meal is not unique to our nation. Wampanoags, we had 4 Thanksgiving meals throughout the year. We'd have a harvest festival when the strawberries were coming. We'd have a harvest festival when the herring were running. We'd have a harvest festival when the corn, and then we'd have a harvest festival in the winter when we were getting our large game. Because that's when there was a lot of food. Like, there's a lot of food, you have a party, So we had 4 of those throughout the year. That in of itself is a very, very good thing. In the Netherlands, they have harvest festivals as well. And actually, I was talking with some people from the Netherlands, and they brought up the point. They said, oh, you know, because the Pilgrims spent time in the Netherlands, they think that that's where they got the idea of this harvest festival, and that they took that event from the Netherlands and brought it here. And I kind of laughed. I'm like, well, I'm pretty sure every culture does this. I mean, that's when you harvest food, so you have a big party. There's a harvest festival, you know, like, yes, you do it in the Netherlands, but I'm pretty sure they did it in the UK and they did it here. Everybody does it. So have more Thanksgivings, not less. Spend time with family and be thoughtful about what you give thanks for.
This is an interesting question. This is from Abby W. And she wonders, how do we respond to people who say that because Frank James created the warrior mascot logo at Nauset Regional High School, that the school should continue to use the mascot?
I'm not even aware of that. So see, this is how much I had no idea that he created that mascot, or that there was even any real issues with it or discussions that were going on around it. So that's not something that I'm familiar with, but I'm sure he put a lot of thought into that. And I will say that there are very appropriate ways that you can use native imagery for you know, those sort of graphic identifiers. You know, where it goes completely awry is when, you know, you've got the Washington Redskins or, you know, high school mascots or others, and they're coupled with, you know, these war chants, and, you know, just you know, and they're just misappropriating our culture and our clothing and everything about it. You know, it becomes really hurtful, and it just reinforces those stereotypes of, you know, Native Americans as being sort of, you know, these not well spoken, you know, mythical bumbling creatures that, you know, were savages, and that's completely not the case. So, you know, when people have healthy conversations with Native communities, they can find elements and images that represent that community in a respectful way.
And I'm going to read the last question first and then jump back to the other. And this is again from FSC, who says to everyone that King Philip's War was fought heavily in and around Sudbury.
Yeah.
Right. And then for the last question, actually it's more of a statement. This comes from the library, possibly from Deb or Karen, who says that they've read the Geraldine Brooks book, loved it, and it was considered for One Book, One Town. And they're recommending a nonfiction book also called Our Beloved Kin by Lisa Brooks. And there's a link there.
Yeah, that's a really good book.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right, and with that, I am going to give the mic back to Deb, the director, to wrap up.
Thank you, Stephen. This was, I'm stuck with the phrase, given that opportunity. And you know, you mentioned given that opportunity, and I think that's something for us not to be terribly proud about, that it, you know, experiences in history are repressed and not represented entirely in both sides of the story, or however you want to express it. I'm not a very eloquent person, but I feel that the 400 commemoration has given us an opportunity. And I keep thinking back on how generous many individuals from the tribe have been to us here in Eastham for many years now. You know, as we started to learn our story here. And I think it's also interesting that this presentation and the exhibit that's on our website, our story exhibit, go back in time, you know, to 1614 or whatever. And that's kind of how we started to tell our story, where we looked at a village drawn by a Frenchman of Nauset here. And that's kind of where we started to tell our story. And so I thank Steve you so much. And I just want to quickly tell you about 2 more upcoming programs. The first is this Monday at 3, and it's Robert Peters. And he's going to talk to us and show us his 2020 calendar images. The calendar is called 13 Moons, a meditation on Indigenous life. And that calendar contains some essays as well. And so the idea will be a presentation of the beautiful art, but also asking everybody to read those essays in advance, and we can have a bit of a discussion. And then in January, Stephen is going to return, and he's going to talk to us about the National Day of Mourning. And I'm very much looking forward to that, because we have this tie with Frank James here on this part of Cape Cod. And I think it was special to many people. And so that is scheduled for when? It's in January, and I've lost my note. Well, anyway, it's on the library calendar. Have you got it, Karen?
Isn't it on the 20th, the 21st? I mean, it's, oh, well.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. It's on our calendar and it's in January. And with all of that, I'm going to thank you all for being here, and have a great evening.